Well, let's move to the next to our next presenter, Anne-Jeanette Glauber. She's going to make a presentation on SEA approaches in the Environmental Sustainability and Climate Change Program, presenting the case study of Michoacan. Anne-Jeanette is a senior environmental specialist at the World Bank, currently based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. She has a master in riparian ecology from the University of Washington in Seattle and a bachelor in environmental science from the University of California at Berkeley. Before moving to the World Bank Africa region, she worked primarily on water and climate change issues in Latin America, where she was working in this project. Anne-Jeanette.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We're staying with North America for the first two presentations, moving to the south. As Fernando said, I will be talking about work that is ongoing with the state of Michoacan in Mexico. I think most of us here would agree that climate change may be the most important challenge of our generation. And it's particularly important with regards to the rural poor and poverty who are so impacted by the variability of climate. And oftentimes what we see is that the fact that there's no clear path for how the climate will change is used often as an excuse for inaction. If you don't know where it's going to go, how do you prepare for it? And I think that for those of us who work on development, the challenge is trying to bring science and use it in a way that has that allows people to make the best decisions that they can. Of course, strategic planning, the ability to incorporate climate change into strategic planning would put us in a much better footing in terms of improving decision making, to make decisions and prioritize actions that allow countries to adapt to the specter of climate change, to mitigate risk, and of course to enhance overall sustainability. For those of you who are not aware of what Mexico is doing in climate change, they are really a world leader at this point. They have clear leadership underneath President Calderon, who has made it a hallmark of his administration to tackle climate change. He's set up some important institutional elements, including this intersecretarial commission, which brings together all the key ministers in sectors that have to do with climate change, either from a mitigation or an adaptation perspective. And he also has committed to a 50% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2050, which is certainly quite ambitious. And he has brought that strategy down to earth, as it were, through the PEC, the Special Program for Climate Change, which basically sets forth baseline targets, baselines and targets for the various sectors and adaptation plans for each of those sectors. And as a result of this plus more, actually Mexico was recently ranked as 8th in the world by the Nonpartisan Climate Performance Index, and you will see them front and center at the COP coming up very soon in Cancun. So the federal level is out front on the issue, and the question is, how do you make it happen? And making it happen, of course, is largely the purview of the states and the municipal governments. And so the next step, the government has sort of turned towards the states and asking them to roll out plans for adaptation and for mitigation. And there is tremendous amount of money in Mexico for this. Each of the 32 states is kind of off and running, but the question is where and how, and what do you do with the millions of dollars that are being thrown at this? To date, there's 2 plans that have been finalized, one for the state of Veracruz and the other for the federal district, the state of Mexico. And those plans, if you look at them, which you are welcome to do, they've spent almost $1 million on each plan, and they are heavily academically focused, limited participation by any of the sectors, really. And as a result, there's not much buy-in, and implementation is likely to be quite challenging, particularly because there is no real prioritization of the actions that are called for. So with that background, the state of Michoacan asked the World Bank to assist them in developing their plan. So in Michoacan, the goal of their climate change plan, like the others, is to, it has both a mitigation and an adaptation side, but we were really focused on the adaptation because that was what they were asking for help with. And the state asked us to work with an SEA approach to guide plan development. And the reason that they were interested in SEA was because they really wanted to sort of counteract what they saw as the limitations of the earlier plans, to really get people, all the sort of participants around the table, to get involved from the beginning so that there was buy-in for the plan, so that it responded to their needs in a meaningful way. And also because it was clear that one of the big impediments to rolling out these plans is the institutional side, right? So how do you go against years and years and years of sort of sectorally focused government programming to come to something that is much more sort of cross-sectoral? So they asked the World Bank to get involved in helping them with this, and I should flag that the idea was not to do an SEA of a plan, it was to use SEA in developing the plan, right? So we started by doing a pretty in-depth stakeholder analysis to look at all the different groups that had something to either had some stake in climate change. Either they were going to win, they were going to lose, they were somehow involved. And we called for a first workshop to basically launch the preparation of the plan, to do some training on strategic environmental assessment, and the goal was to set the priorities for the plan, to sort of scope what the plan would focus on. And it became clear quite quickly that the combination of real uncertainty about how the climate was going to change, the very different levels of understanding of the science of climate change, coupled with the fact that climate change is so cross-cutting, it's almost impossible to prioritize because everybody thinks what they're working on is the most important, right? So we basically stepped back and had to think how we were going to, now here's my magic pointer, but basically our problem really was how do we get to the screening stage, the scoping stage of SEA. We were struggling with that. So right here, I assume that most of you in the room are familiar with SEA. You know that basically these are the sort of the general steps in putting together an SEA. And what we did was we went out and we looked at many different adaptation plans from around the world and tried to come up with best practice on adaptation planning so that we could try to get some improved methodology around how to sort of get everybody focused on, what did the science really say and how could they prioritize actions as a result of that. And I get one message that comes out loud and clear is how basically if you look at good adaptation planning in SEA, you're often talking about the same things with different words, right? And they're very similar in terms of the process. So one thing that should really be flagged is this Australian plan listed here has a great approach. It's a risk-based approach, participatory approach. It's a matrix, which I'm going to talk about right now. We decided to use that in Michoacan, bringing together experts, practitioners, public, private sector around the table to talk about adaptation in Michoacan. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Mexico, Michoacan is on the western Pacific side. It is a land of contrasts. You have the warm Pacific currents. You have 2 high mountain ranges. You have tropical rainforest, and you basically have a variety of temperature and rainfall patterns that make agriculture really quite successful. It is, if you eat avocados, you probably eat your avocados from Michoacan. It is responsible for 90% of the avocado production in Mexico that comes straight to the United States. And of course, this is all around in the irrigated land. 60% of the state, though, is not irrigated, and that largely goes to corn. And corn, of course, is very important for food security and for poverty. And as a result, there's a lot of interest from the state to focus first and foremost on corn production and the impacts of climate change on corn because it is so dependent on the climate, and also on water because it's a very water scarce area. And this is just quickly, we basically did some downscaled climate modeling, and what you see is that the models basically all agree that it's getting warmer and that by the end of the century it's going to be on average about 3 degrees warmer across the state of Michoacan. And what we tried to do was compare this downscaled climate model to a suite of climate models. And basically the message is that while some things aren't so clear, like what's going to happen with rainfall, more or less, what the patterns are, the message is very clear on temperature that it's going up, it's getting hotter, soil moisture is going down. And that obviously has big impacts for agriculture. And so what we did with the state of Michoacan, as I said, was to do another workshop focused on this risk matrix where we brought together experts in water and in agriculture, particularly in corn. And we walked through an exercise, and there's a series of matrices, and I'll just quickly go over them to say that the first thing you do is you focus on the areas where the science is clear. The science is clear, it is getting hotter. What does that mean for water? What does that mean for corn production? And basically what you see here is just to give you one example, like on the bottom second, or the bottom row, second cell, we're looking at what are the impacts of higher temperatures on water quantity. Well, you have more evaporation, you have more demand for water. So in other words, not only is it getting hotter, but you have less water to deal with even when you need more, right? So we go through this exercise where we look at the impacts, and then we look at sort of the combination of the likelihood of that impact happening and the severity of the consequence, right? And it gets everybody to sort of focus, and it's color-coded. Long story short, it brings out very clearly where you need to focus, what is the real risk, where is the real impact, and what should you focus on first. And to give you a sense on the corn side here, quickly, the graph on the left shows rainfall. This is looking at annual rainfall grouped by La Nina and El Nino years. So we're looking at ENSO impacts on corn production. And you can see the green column shows you that you get about 2 tons per hectare in the average year. The red shows you that in a drier El Nino year, you have slightly less corn production, and the blue La Nina bar shows you that you have more corn in a wetter year. So what that says is that since we are finally getting our handle around being able to predict these things, if you can basically work with farmers and get the information to farmers so that they know it's going to be a wetter or a drier year, they can build adaptation mechanisms. They can learn, do you need to irrigate when, et cetera, et cetera. So that's quite helpful. On the right, you see, of course, the story is always more complicated once you start digging into it. This shows you the variability of rainfall on an annual basis against corn production. And I think the first message, which is really important, which is that climate variability is already huge, okay? It's a big issue, and it's expected to increase. So when you're talking about managing for climate change, if you can manage to deal with the variability of the existing climate, you really are doing a lot to help help the situation improve. And the message right here, though, is that there is no clear linkage between whether you have a lot of rain or a low rain in terms of the corn production, because the story is it's about timing. If you have a lot of rain at the wrong time, you have a problem with your corn. If you have it at the right time, it can be a bumper year. So again, in terms of thinking about the adaptation responses, you need to understand a little bit more about the specific problem at hand. And then based on this kind of information, the workshop went through and prioritized adaptation measures. So what sorts of things should be done, and they looked at sort of the timing of them, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and that was how we went through this exercise. And so just to quickly turn this over to the next person, again, we're midway right now. There's still a lot of work to be done, but the important message is that it has been highly effective at sort of bringing people together, getting them interested, involved, and engaged, which is, of course, going to be critical to moving forward. I think the message on climate change is, of course, what we should do now is work to increase and improve efficiency, right? Under any climate change or no climate change, that will improve the situation on the ground, and that there was a large consensus that the so-called no-regret measures, those measures which make sense with or without climate change, are sort of where we should start first when it comes to adaptation, because in general, the type of adaptations continue the same with or without climate change, and the question is how badly do we need them and how much of them do we need? So in conclusion, the climate change is a real challenge. It requires multi-sectoral and participatory approaches in my opinion, to start working on. The methodologies, in order to be effective, need to be science-based and focused on the issues that are of import to the people who are affected most, right? This risk management approach was very useful, and SEA sort of provided a really good framework from which to approach the issues. And the climate variability, of course, is the big story in the short and medium term. It's likely to increase, and as a result, to the extent where you can highlight cost-effective measures to basically improve your resilience to that climate variability, you'll be in much better shape. Thanks.